Now, the last thing you're going to be doing in section 9.7 with these complex numbers is looking at how to add and subtract. And really, all you have to think about when you go to add or subtract is you basically want to treat the I like it's a variable. It's almost like combining like terms. So if you have two complex numbers and you want to add them together, then all you're going to do is take the real parts and add them. And then you're going to take the imaginary parts and add them. All right, and it's going to work the same with a difference, but you do have to remember when you have a difference that you have to distribute that negative. So this is going to be like subtracting C and subtracting DI. But as long as I note that, then again, I'm going to subtract the real parts. And then I'm going to take the imaginary parts. And I'm going to subtract them as well. All right, so it's a lot like what we did with solving the equations. Right there, we set the real parts equal to each other. Here, we're just combining the real parts together. So, for example, if I want to add these two complex numbers together, I'm going to take the real parts and add them, right? 2 plus 4 is 6. And I'm going to take the imaginary parts and add them, right? So 3i plus negative I, that's like taking 3i and subtracting 1i. And so that's going to leave me with a positive 2i. And then this would be the new complex number that I get when I add those two together. All right, so let's look at a subtraction. All right, so over here I see that I'm subtracting. And so again, I'm going to take the real parts first. And I'm going to subtract those real parts. Now be careful with your signs here. You've got -1 minus -6. Right, so essentially that's like -1 plus 6, which means the real part here is going to be +5. And then if I take my imaginary parts, and again be careful with the signs, and I subtract them, then I'm looking at 5i minus -2i, right? That's like 5i plus 2i, which would combine to 7i. So my new complex number is going to be 5 plus 7i for the imaginary part. Now, as always, you know, any that I don't work through on this video with you, I will post the completed notes for you later. I'm just going to kind of pick and choose some of the main ones here. One thing I do want to mention is that if you have any negatives underneath the square root, make sure you simplify that, bring out the I before you start trying to add or subtract. And so that's what you're going to see is happening here. All right, in this example, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this in terms of I instead of the square root of -1. So I'm going to rewrite this as -7 plus, and the square root of -1 by definition is I, minus 7. And then this would become I times the square root of 9, all right, which is I times 3, or 3i. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my real parts. This is a difference here. So I'm going to subtract my real parts. -7 minus 7 would be -14. So that's going to be my real part. And then I'm going to take my imaginary parts. That's going to be I minus 3i, which is -2i. And that's going to be my imaginary part here. All right, now it works the same for, you know, 3 complex numbers. If you have that, again, just work with the real parts, work with the imaginary parts, just like you do when you're combining like terms. All right, so again, I'll post the other 3 for you when I post the notes. But in section 9.7, this is what you're going to be looking at. Writing things in terms of I, making sure you don't leave the negative underneath the square root. Adding and subtracting your complex numbers. And then remembering that if you need to solve an equation, you can set the real parts equal to each other. You can set the imaginary parts equal to each other.